Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. It was 2009. I was 9. We lived on the third floor of a small, fading apartment block in North Nazimabad, Karachi. The building was one of those beige, cube-shaped complexes built in the 90s, now stained darker by humidity, car exhaust, and time. The stairwell always smelled like dust, old paint, and sometimes the sharp soreness of garbage left too long outside someone's door. Our unit was tiny. 2 bedrooms, 1 narrow lounge, and a kitchen crammed into a corner like an afterthought. The ceiling fans buzzed even when they were off, as if the wiring hummed with a tired pulse. The landline phone sat on a short wooden side shelf near the lounge. It had a curly wire twisted into permanent loops, a beige handset faded almost white with years of palm sweat, and football-shaped stickers my cousin once stuck on it that we never fully managed to peel off. It wasn't cordless. It was old enough that you could hear electricity in the earpiece when you lifted it before even dialing. My parents still used it because internet home packages came cheaper with landlines and mobile minutes used to run out fast back then. Our apartment at night had its own personality. Not scary in daylight, but after midnight every sound stretched longer than it should. The ticking of the wall clock sounded like slow footsteps. The fridge compressor thudded like a door shutting far away. Cars on the road below made whooshing noises that traveled up the concrete walls like ocean waves trapped in a shell. In 2009, load shedding wasn't rare either, so the hall outside was often dim. Even when the power stayed on, the bulbs were low-watt, yellow weak. The kind that produced shadows but not clarity. That night, I wasn't even supposed to be awake. The room I shared with my older sister was dark, except for the small red LED glow from our old tape deck player plugged into the wall beneath the window. Rain earlier that evening had left the air sticky and warm. The bedsheets clung to my knees when I shifted. I kept waking up in pieces, half asleep, half aware, drifting like a loose page in a quiet room. My throat was dry. My thoughts were slow. I remember looking at the clock when I finally sat up fully. The green digital numbers read 20:34 a.m. The building outside was silent, quiet enough that when a dog barked in the next street, the echo showed up like a fingerprint. I lay back down again. Then, at 20:37 a.m., the landline rang. The suddenness punched me awake. The ring was sharp and full, not like the tired electricity noises the phone sometimes made. This was an incoming call. Clean, aggressive. 2 long rings, then a short one like someone impatient, unsure whether to keep going or stop. My parents were deep sleepers. Their room door was half open, a dark rectangle framing their silence. The fan in their room rotated lazily, chopping the air into slow beats. My sister was asleep facing the wall. No one else stirred. The phone rang again. Another long ring. Then silence for half a second, just enough for doubt to slip in. Then another ring. I slid out of bed carefully. The floor tiles were cold because rainwater earlier had cooled them. I tiptoed through the narrow hallway to the lounge. The building's external window panes always rattled slightly in wind, so the silence felt strange without it. The lounge had that filtered street, light glow pressing in from outside. Enough to vaguely show the couches, the old center table, the cabinet where we kept school books and bills, but not enough to show edges cleanly. The phone rang again. This time softer, shorter, almost shy. I reached for it. My fingers brushed the curly wire first, then the handset. Lifting it always made a tiny plastic crack, the same sound every time. That sound was the only proof I had crossed the line from observer to participant. I pressed the receiver button like I had seen my dad do hundreds of times. I put the handset to my ear. Light static greeted me immediately. Not harsh, not heavy, light, like empty TV snow at low volume, a faint hiss. The kind you hear when you tune old radios between stations. I whispered hello. My voice felt too loud against the small background noise of nothingness. No answer. Static kept running in a thin line through my ear. Then a click, tap sound started. At first I thought it was interference. But interference doesn't follow rhythm. This had a slow, deliberate pace. A soft click, then a slight pause, then another. Like someone carefully pressing landline number buttons one by one. The sound was distant enough to feel like it came from a machine, not a person, but close enough that it felt like it came from inside my head. Then I whispered hello again. That's when I heard the dialing tone. Not random noise. The exact tone our landline made when dialing out. That familiar rising beep boop, clean and unmistakable. The one I had memorized without trying because in 2009 we used phones like we used spoons. Basic, daily, essential, unexamined. Someone was dialing numbers using my connected line, and the tone was playing directly in my ear as they dialed. I didn't understand how that could even happen. I wasn't dialing anything. I was listening. Yet the phone behaved as if someone else had control of the outgoing channel. The tone played through the line while static still lingered behind it like thin fog. One-digit tone, then pause. Another dial tone, then another, slow, patient, no rush, no shaking, no fumbling. Precise, unpanicked, like someone familiar with what they were doing. Then came the breathing. It slid in between tones like water through cracks. Soft, calm, steady. The kind of breathing you hear when someone is close to a mic but not trying to hide. Not angry breathing, not scared, just present, intimate, real. A person breathing into my ear through a device that should never carry breath unless a mouth was directly next to the other side. Each inhale was smooth, each exhale slightly heavier, warm in illusion even though it was electronic. My chest tightened. Not dramatically, just child fear turned physical, shrinking lungs, tense shoulders, a cold drop in the stomach like missing a step in darkness. My brain told me it was just a phone, but my body said predator. I pulled the phone slightly away without hanging up. The static stayed. The dial tone came again, another digit sound. Then another breath, timed as if they could feel me listening. Then sudden silence. Just cold dead air on the line. Then the call dropped. The droning emptiness that follows a line dying buzzed for half a second then went blank. I placed the handset back slowly. The curly wire bounced once, then stilled. The receiver button reset with a soft mechanical sigh. I stood there a long time. Karachi nights are layered. Fans in neighbors' rooms. Cats bumping garbage bags. The occasional rickshaw engine coughing in the distance. A pipe dripping somewhere unidentified. But my ears filtered it all out. My mind kept replaying the dial tone, the breathing pattern, the impossible overlap of incoming line and outgoing digits. Next morning's sunlight disinfected nothing, but it gave the impression of safety. The lounge looked small again. The phone looked old and harmless, resting like a cheap plastic artifact that shouldn't carry threat memory. My parents were making breakfast noises in the kitchen. My sister was brushing her hair. I checked the phone's last dialed numbers list out of curiosity. Empty. Clean. No record of outgoing digits. My dad later explained that sometimes glitching exchanges or short circuits in old PTCL lines or crossed connections in neighborhood distribution boxes could allow audio feedback loops that sound like dialing tones even when you're not the one dialing. He said old urban wiring can behave in bizarre ways, especially in packed areas where one junction box feeds dozens of apartments with aging insulation, and rainwater sometimes seeps into external cables, and sometimes computer-controlled exchange boxes drop call logs when there is a signal instability or sudden line break. His explanation comforted my brain, but it did not comfort my spine, because breathing is never a glitch. That evening my dad unplugged the phone himself. Not because he believed it was dangerous, but because he got irritated that it rang at night for no reason and woke the baby next door once. In 2009, people unplugged landlines at night the same way people started locking room doors after watching crime serials. Not paranoia, just a new urban habit. For a week I watched the side shelf where the phone once lived like a missing tooth in a smile. The silence it left behind was quieter than the silence before it ever rang. Nights returned to their usual stitched sound college, but something had changed in me. I learned that fear does not need monsters. All it needs is proximity, unpredictability, and intention. Humans are enough. Wiring failures, network exchanges, distribution boxes, crossed lines. These are the guitar strings. But humans pluck them. Years later, when Karachi switched to digital VoIP routers and landlines became cleaner, exchange boxes smarter, and call databases redundant, I realized what scared me the most wasn't the call. It was the idea that infrastructure can be violated quietly without leaving evidence, and a child standing in a dim lounge at 2:37 a.m. has no tools, no context, and no firewall against a moment designed by someone invisible but human. I never found out who was on that other side. Maybe a board line technician testing exchange tones late at night. Maybe a neighbor's faulty splitter crossing outgoing audio into incoming channels. Maybe someone experimenting with call routing equipment in the local box. Maybe a scavenger tapping lines illegally to make free calls. Maybe all of these layered together. But one thing was clear: it was real, mechanical, possible, human, and brief enough to evade record. And that is why, even now, when a phone rings in a quiet house after midnight, part of my ear expects static, part expects tone, and a smaller, older part still braces for breath. The phone wasn't plugged back in after that night. My dad replaced it years later with a VoIP modem system, then eventually stopped using landlines at all because mobile packages improved, broadband routers didn't need phone bundles, and spam callers increased. The side shelf is still there, different wood polish now, still too small, still holding random objects no one cares about. Keys, old chargers, sometimes an empty teacup left in rush. It looks mundane, innocent. But if you stand in the dark beside it at 2:37 a.m., it still knows how to whisper old fear into new silence. I was 11 in 2013, studying in a government school in Multan. The school was old even back then, built sometime in the late 80s, maybe earlier. No one really knew the exact year. The walls were faded beige, the paint peeling in long sharp flakes. The building had a smell that never fully went away: chalk dust, soaked concrete, sun-hot metal windows, and sweat. My classroom was on the second floor. Every step up the stairs felt uneven, because the edges were chipped, and decades of shoes had worn them into shallow sloping dips. The iron railing was coated with dust that clung to your palm if you touched it. I learned early not to grip it unless I absolutely had to. Break time was the loudest part of the day. The bell would scream through the air at 10:15 a.m., a harsh electric ring that crackled slightly at the end, as if the wiring was tired. The minute it rang, hundreds of students spilled into the hallways, down the stairs, into the courtyard, into the canteen, into every tiny open space that could hold human bodies. The courtyard was just a patch of cracked ground with a few trees planted randomly, trunks wrapped in decades, old white lime paint halfway up. Boys played cricket with a tennis ball that was almost always flat. The ball hit the walls more than the bat. Dust clouds lifted with every sprint, mixing into the morning sun like smoke. The bathroom was behind the science block, on the ground floor, tucked into a corner where sunlight barely reached. The tiles were once white, but time had turned them a permanent shade of stained gray. Some tiles were missing, leaving jagged cement scars. The roof had slow leaks even in the summer. During August and September rains, the water dripped steadily from thin cracks above like beads forming in painful slow motion. Even when it was dry outside, dark damp spots bloomed on the ceiling and never healed. The fans inside were metal-bladed, humming constantly even when switched off, like they held leftover motion in their bones. At 10:18 a.m. on the dot, 3 minutes after break started, I needed the bathroom. No dramatic reason, just the usual childhood problem of holding it too long. My footsteps echoed a little as I walked across the narrow side hall that led to the stalls. The hallway outside the bathroom was always less crowded than the rest of the school, but still held a slow flow of students. I pushed through the wooden door, swollen slightly at the bottom from years of water exposure. It groaned louder than it should every time it moved. Inside was the usual scene. Chipped sinks on the left, dark mirrors with cloudy silverbacks that distorted faces like funhouse glass, and stalls lined up in a row on the right. I walked into the third stall. It was the only one that fully closed that day. The latch was rust-thick, orange-brown, flaking crumbs onto my finger when I slid it in place. The metal felt cold even though it was summer. The door swung stiffly but sealed shut. I locked it. Then I waited in silence, which was rare in school bathrooms, because usually there were whispers, shuffling shoes, bucket splashes, kids banging doors out of habit. But for a few seconds, everything calmed. Maybe the break rush had pulled everyone outdoors at that exact moment. It never felt strange until later, when I replayed it over and over. Then came the tapping. It wasn't banging. It wasn't loud. It was small, light, quick taps, like fingertips or knuckles barely touching metal. 3 taps first. A half-second pause. Then 2 more. I remember the rhythm because it clung to memory like something sticky. I thought it was one of my friends trying to scare me for fun, or to tell me to hurry up. That kind of joke was normal. Still, a prickle ran across my upper back for no reason I could name then. Something about the tap was too soft, too controlled. Not rushed, not giggly, not impatient. It felt measured, deliberate, like someone who knew exactly what pressure to use to make a sound and not more. I unlocked the latch. A tiny puff of rust dust floated into the air as it slid open. I opened the door fast and smiled without thinking, expecting a face, a grin, a raised eyebrow, anything. Empty. No one was there. No shoes under nearby stalls. No shadows. No movement. The air felt thicker suddenly, like heat gathers right before a storm, even though this was just a normal June morning. Sunlight cut in rectangles through the tiny high windows, but stopped short of the stall doors, leaving the lower half of the room permanently dim. My eyes adjusted faster than my brain could form a reason. Then I saw the footprints. Tiny wet, bare footprints, child-sized, darker than the floor, leading away from the stall I had opened. They looked like someone with small feet had stepped in water and walked across dry, dusty stone. The prints were too clean to be from a shoe. You could see the faint curve of a heel, the toe mounds, even the slight, uneven spread of a kid's foot that hasn't grown into balance yet. The water wasn't pooling around them, so it wasn't fresh splashing. It was just thin wetness, like someone stepped elsewhere and carried it in. The school bathrooms did have buckets near the sinks sometimes, but they were crud, covered plastic, never clean enough to show crisp footprints, unless someone was dripping wet. And the prints were too small to be any student, I recognized. Most kids in my class wore sandals or dusty Bata shoes. None walked barefoot around school. Not on that floor. Not ever. The footprints marched away at a slight angle, left, right, steady, small pacing, not hurried, not skipping, not dragging. They crossed past the adjacent stall, toward the sinks. The wet faded as the steps continued, as water always does when pressed against dust, but the shape stayed. I remember feeling a sudden drop in my stomach. My pupils probably went wide, because the world looked sharper, edges too defined, like adrenaline-pumped contrast into reality. I didn't follow them physically. The idea formed in my mind, but my legs were frozen. I followed them with my eyes instead, tracking the path like my gaze was a hand brushing along a map. The prints reached the sink. The last pair sat right in front of the middle basin. Then they just stopped. No return prints, no print loops, no side trails, no faded exit path, just an unfinished sentence in dark, wet footsteps. The sink area usually had a slow puddle under it from kids slopping water out while washing hands. But that puddle was always a dirty, dark oval, not a source for tiny footprints that led in one direction only. The drainage pipe underneath the sink was metal, rust bubbled like infected skin, leaking a slow dark drip even when no water ran. The pipe was too high for someone to have been standing on it, and even a stunt like climbing wouldn't erase a trail. There should have been some disturbance. Something. Anything. Humans can't move without evidence. My heartbeat was brutally loud in my ears, like someone had turned speakers inside my skull. I could hear the fast, uneven pounding, small pauses between beats like my body was glitching. My throat felt dry and narrow. My tongue pressed against the top of my mouth without permission. My hands shook, but only a little, a fine tremor, like the rattle of a loose windowpane vibrating when a truck passes far away. I stepped to the sink slowly. The tiles around it were cracked spider web style. Someone had carved their initials into the basin years ago with a sharp object. The letters were black from gathered grime. I splashed water on my hands too fast, not caring about soap, just smearing water and scrubbing lightly, not washing properly at all. The water was lukewarm because the tank on the roof trapped heat, but it still shocked me like ice. I turned the tap off too quickly. Tap noises in that bathroom always ended with a tired after drip. But this time the silence after it was loud in its own way, like someone snatched sound right out of the air. I dried my hands on my uniform shirt, because the towel hook was empty and always had been. My uniform was the standard government, school light blue shirt and darker blue pants. The fabric was thin and cheap, catching sweat instantly, sticking to skin in the summer. As I ran out of the bathroom, the dampness clung to my palms like a second layer of fear. My shoes were cheap black school shoes with weak soles. I remember feeling every stone bump underfoot as if the ground itself was passing information into my bones. I didn't scream. I didn't talk. I didn't tell anyone. That was the scariest part, how a moment like that buries itself silently inside you, like a splinter you never remove. At 11:00 a.m. class resumed. I sat on a wooden bench with metal legs, paint chipped off the corners. The desk surface was carved with names and knife point doodles. My arms rested on it automatically. My mind was spinning full speed while my face stayed still. Kids around me were laughing, roughhousing memories of cricket hits and canteen snacks. My shirt smelled of sweat and sun-dried dust, no hints of anything unusual in the world outside me. Days passed. Weeks passed, then months. I paid more attention to small things after that. The slight differences in footsteps. How water patterns splashed differently depending on the user. How dust captured history in thin layers. I noticed stains that had probably always been there but now had meaning. It made the world feel dangerous but in a real earthly way. Not a fairy tale way. Not a ghost way. Just evidence that strange things can happen without needing monsters. By 2015, 2 years later, the school did a minor renovation. They replaced some bathroom tiles, added a new drain, slapped fresh white paint over the sinks. It smelled like wet cement for weeks. The new tiles were still mismatched, budget, grade cheap, uneven color batches. But they were new. The footprints never happened again. I went back into that same stall dozens of times after that over the years, testing memory against reality, waiting for a repeat, a pattern, a clue. Anything. Nothing. Blank normal reality every time. Weirdly, that lack of a repeat was its own closure. I eventually realized I didn't need answers for every strange thing. Some moments are alarms without beeps, warnings without words. I finished that school in 2018, passed out in the same sun and dust environment, climbed those chipped stairs thousands of times, and carried that bathroom moment as a tiny private scar of growing up. The ending wasn't dramatic, but it was clear. The world didn't break after that day. My brain did a retrofit instead, building caution quietly behind the scenes so I could survive in the real world. I still remember the exact time, 10:18 a.m., like a timestamp burned into wet stone. No ghosts, no fairy tales, just a moment when reality acted sharper than a storybook ever could, then gave me a good clean ending. I ran out. I lived. I learned, and that was enough. It was winter 2007. I was 7. We were living in Marie in a rented house that was older than anyone I knew. It was one of those British-era houses, the kind built long before Pakistan existed, standing stiff on a quiet pine-covered slope. The house had thick gray stone walls, black wooden beams, tiny old windows, and a roof that collected mist like it was part of its design. The landlord said it was built for officers in the 1800s, renovated only when absolutely needed, and rented mostly to families who wanted more space than the new concrete houses offered. From the outside, it looked charming in a faded postcard way. But inside, it felt different, not magical, not haunted, just old, tired, and full of strange little details that didn't belong to a normal childhood memory, but still burned themselves into mine. By 6:09 p.m., right after Maghrib, darkness always arrived fast in Marie winters. The sun would vanish behind the hills early, and cold air would push inside through every crack, making the wooden floors shrink and sigh at night. The rooms upstairs were covered in dark cedar wood. The color itself made the space feel dim even in daylight. But after prayer time, it felt twice as shadowed. We rarely turned on lights immediately to save electricity, and also because my father believed in not wasting power, especially in hill stations where bills spiked in winter. The house had a long hallway that ran straight from the top of the staircase to the bedrooms at the end. The staircase was narrow, made of polished wood that was once smooth, but now had dull spots from decades of shoes, boots, luggage, and hands sliding over the banister. At the top landing, there was a small study room on the left. That room was always kept mostly closed because it had the weakest insulation. It was small, maybe 8 by 10 feet. One desk, one old chalkboard mounted on the wall like a classroom board, 2 chairs, and a shelf with old screws, spare keys, and a stack of blank notebooks my father had left there. That chalkboard was my father's. He used it sometimes to jot down reminders or draw rough math when helping my older cousins during summer visits. Earlier that day, around 4 p.m., before it got dark, I had passed by that room twice. The board was clean. No chalk in sight. No writing. Nothing. My mother asked me to put my school bag away. That bag was small navy blue, with 2 thin straps and a single white line across the front. Zippers stiff from cold every winter. The school badge was ironed on slightly crooked because it had peeled once in rain earlier that monsoon. Inside, the bag smelled like pencil shavings, a little sweat, old paper, and winter scarves my mother insisted on folding inside in case the evening got colder during commute. I climbed upstairs carrying it like I always did. Boots on. The boots were black, Velcro straps because I still couldn't tie laces properly. The rubber soles were slightly loose, making a flat tapping sound as I walked. Upstairs always smelled like colder wood, metal, dust, and faint traces of kerosene from the heater we sometimes used. No strong scent. Nothing out of place. Just the house exhaling age. As I stepped into the hallway, the study room door was half open. Not strange at first. Doors shifted sometimes because of the cold, wood expanding and contracting, old hinges moving a little on their own. But the way it was open caught me for a second. Not wide. Not shut. Just half open, like someone had pushed it gently and stopped midway. The room inside was darker than the rest of the hallway. The window was small and almost useless after sunset, fogged at the corners with winter moisture. The chalkboard was visible even in the low light because it was dusty matte black, catching what little evening glow slipped in. On it was a single word, Faraz, written in a style a child should never see on something that was earlier clean. The letters were uneven, shaky, each stroke thick then thin then thick again, like whoever wrote it had changed pressure without realizing. The F leaned too far forward. The A had a flat top instead of a pointed one. The R looked almost broken in the middle, like the chalk dragged. The Z at the end curled slightly downward like a failed underline, jagged, crooked, not cursive, not printed properly. Just hammered onto the board like someone's hand was cold, tense, or careless. My name at that age was not Faraz. That was never my name. My cousin Faraz had visited, sure, but only to the lounge downstairs. He never came upstairs during that visit, and even if he had, he was a neat older cousin who wrote slowly and properly, not like this. Not shaky, not damaged looking, and definitely not on a board that was clean hours ago. Below the chalkboard, on the wooden floor, a piece of chalk lay in two parts. Snapped cleanly but violently. Not like chalk breaking from being dropped accidentally. One piece was longer, one shorter. The broken ends were sharp, grainy and white. Still dusty like they hadn't been touched after breaking. Around it, little crumbs of chalk powder spread in a tiny star pattern, the kind you only see when something is hit or pressed too hard in the same spot twice. The chalk wasn't old either. My father's chalk pieces were always full. Rounded tips, never broken earlier. The desk below the board had nothing written on it. No fingerprints. No smudges. The chairs were tucked in. No sign someone dragged anything. The chalkboard eraser was still sitting on the top left corner of the board frame, undusted, meaning nobody had cleaned after writing, which made the snapped chalk even more alarming. It had been broken either before writing or mid-stroke. The letters looked rough enough to have been written with force or frustration, like someone pressed too hard without caring. I stood there holding my bag strap in my fist. The cold air coming from the open study room hit my face harder than the hallway air, making my nose sting lightly. My throat was clear at that age. No sickness. Just a small sting of winter dryness from breathing in cold air too fast. The only sound was the house shifting itself in the evening. Tiny ticks from wood cooling down. A faint wind pushing outside pine branches. No footsteps. No laughter. No cousins. No reason for that board to look the way it did at that exact moment. I took a few steps closer. The floorboards creaked a little because of the cold weight distribution under my boots. The closer I got, the clearer the letters became. That jagged font, uneven spacing and childish force behind it became more real, embedding deeper into that moment. No poetic flair. No storybook patterns. Just unsettling reality. The chalk pieces were slightly damp. Not wet, but enough to show the room held more cold moisture than other spaces in the house. The study room was always the coldest, but chalk holding moisture meant someone had either written right before I came, or the chalk had sat on that floor longer than expected in that moisture. The wall around the board had faint white dust marks, meaning chalk had hit the surface too aggressively, spraying lightly outside the letter strokes. Someone didn't just write my cousin's name. Someone hit the chalk with enough stress to break it in half, then wrote with uneven force. Leaning forward like the board itself was something they wanted to mark permanently before leaving. I carried the bag to my room without touching anything else. The hallway looked normal again as soon as I stepped back out. My door was wooden, slightly swollen at the bottom from winter wet air. Inside, the heater was off, so the room remained cold. My bed had thick blankets with floral patterns common in old hill station homes. The window glass had fog at the edges. Perfect silence apart from the soft tapping of my bag, hitting the bed as I dropped it there. I pushed the bag under the desk, after opening the heater later. The warmth made the zipper relax slightly when touched again, that typical sound of cold metal loosening under heat. I didn't tell anyone at that age. Not because I was brave, but because as a child, I simply thought someone real must have done it, and the truth would come out later with logic, not fear. Children normalize fear when they don't yet have words for unease. The next day, my father checked the board and rubbed it clean with no reaction or concern. The chalk pieces were gone by morning, likely swept during night cleaning by my mother without noticing. The study room door was fully shut again. Everything looked normal. Just a board, clean again like nothing odd had happened. Years passed. Grew older, understood more. Lived in newer houses, newer cities, cleaner walls, better insulation, brighter hallways. But that name stayed jagged in my memory. The broken chalk. The slanted F, the flat, topped A. The forced R, the curling Z. The timing after prayer when day and night overlap like ink bleeding. Today, I explain it with logic. Maybe a delivery worker, repairman, or even a neighborhood kid once slipped in through the study room window when it was open earlier, broke the chalk out of childish curiosity, scribbled the first name they thought of, then left quickly through the same window, before the cold fog thickened. Maybe the chalk broke because they pressed too hard testing it before writing. Maybe it looked shaky because the hand was freezing in that unheated room. Maybe the chalk felt damp because Marie winters attack uninsulated rooms with silent moisture. Every maybe is grounded, human, real, no ghosts, no stories inside stories. Just a moment of cold human oddness intersecting with a child who was too young to decode the fear behind it. The ending became clear only when I grew old enough to understand that not everything terrifying needs a ghost. Sometimes it only needs you to be small, alone, and passing a dark room at the wrong second, when someone real and unknown has left a mark that was never meant for you, but that still stays with you longer than any fairy tale ever could. The house stayed old, the hills stayed silent, and I grew up. That's the closure. Not a mystery, not a demon. Just an unexplainably sharp memory from a very real winter evening in Marie that I survived simply by walking past it, and nothing more. I remember that night in a way that feels too sharp for something that happened when I was 10. My brain should have softened it, blurred it, the way old memories fade at the edges. But this one never did. Maybe because I was half awake when it happened. Maybe because night trains have a strange way of making you feel like you're watching the world through someone else's eyes, like you're not fully part of it, just drifting along with the tracks. It was 2012. The winter was heavy that year. Lahore had already been wrapped in its night chill when we boarded, but the real cold hit once the train rolled out of the city. Even inside the compartment, the air felt thin and biting. My parents had managed to book an AC sleeper cabin because it was a long ride to Rawalpindi, and they wanted some comfort. In Pakistan, trains are never perfectly clean, even the good cabins. The sheets were washed but smelled faintly of steel dust and old detergent. The window glass had smudges, fingerprints from countless travelers, a thin greasy layer that never really comes off. Outside, the train yard lights made the metal sides gleam, long yellow stripes sliding across the surface like paint. Our cabin had 2 upper berths and 2 lower berths. My father took one lower side, my mother the other. I was on a lower berth too, but closer to the window. The mattress was firm but uneven, a little sunken in the middle. The pillow was too thick. I kept shifting it under my head, trying to find a sweet spot that didn't push my chin toward my chest. The cabin door was a sliding panel with a lock that made a loud clank sound when it engaged. I remember the way my father checked it twice before settling. Outside the door, the narrow corridor had dim lamps that buzzed a little, not loud enough to wake anyone, but loud enough to irritate your thoughts when you were trying to sleep. The train moved at 9:15 p.m., later than scheduled, as usual. The initial lurch forward made all the overhead luggage rattle like the cabin was coughing awake. Vendors on the platform faded as we picked up speed, tea flasks packed away. Shawl-wrapped men slipping back toward waiting rooms. My parents were talking softly at first, but the words washed into murmurs as the rhythmic clack of train wheels took over the space. That sound always becomes the main voice of the night, steady, hypnotic, almost like a heartbeat you share with the machine. By 10:30 p.m., most of the lights outside were gone. The train crossed open patches of farmland, then stretches where nothing stood but fence lines and silent utility poles. Every so often we'd pass a small settlement, a cluster of mud brick homes or a lonely shop with faded boards. It was the kind of quiet that doesn't relax you, the kind that waits. I remember staring at the motion for a long time before sleep began to creep over me, heavy as a wool blanket. I didn't fall asleep quickly. Children rarely do when they're excited or uneasy. I kept glancing at the passing night in gaps, small blinks of awareness like waking up between dreams. At one point, probably close to midnight, I noticed the fog forming outside. First thin like smoke trails, then thickening into slow white drapes. Fog in Pakistan stations is different from the fog I saw later in life abroad. It carries dust, oil, diesel scent, a dryness inside the mist. It doesn't bead on your window glass like dew. Instead, it looks matte, like a chalk eraser smudge in the air. The winter fog erases distance more than it creates atmosphere. At 1:20 a.m., I woke because the train slowed. Not a full wake up, just enough awareness to feel motion changing. My neck was stiff from the pillow. My throat was dry from the cabin heater. My mother shifted in her sleep, one arm hanging off the edge of her berth. My father had a coat draped over him. The slowing became longer. The brake hiss began. Stations announced themselves by sound long before they announced themselves by sight. Gujranwala Station, 1:44 a.m. The train slid into the platform at a lazy crawl. The stop's timing burned itself into my mind, because the digital clock of the station passed my window, as the fog parted just enough to let the red LUD numbers glow through. The station platform was long, concrete, built a bit wide, but at that hour it looked like a forgotten runway. The floodlights were there, but dimmed by mist. The overhang of the station roof had old metal supports painted green decades ago, now chipped and flaking. The fog hugged pillar tops like cotton stuffed between beams. Most vendors were packing up, tea stalls shutting flaps, cloth bundles tied, crates stacked. Only a few workers were moving. Migrant labor types, thin men with dusty clothes, dragging carts or sweeping the platform with short brooms that made scraping sounds on concrete. One old man with a tray of boiled eggs was closing a tin cover over it, his wool cap pulled low. His shape looked like a tilted chess piece in the haze. Dogs were sleeping curled under benches, tails tucked, bodies like brown stones. You see details like these only when you're not awake enough to judge them, just absorb them. The glass window next to my berth was cold to the touch. The train had that creaking pause, the moment where the world outside seems to lean a little closer to inspect the passengers. Maybe that's why I did it. Why I leaned forward and stared. I wasn't thinking about fear yet. I was thinking about shapes. The way fog turns humans into half-formed ideas. The way train halts delay time and make seconds feel heavier. Then it happened. A face at the window. The glass was fogged from the outside but not fully opaque, more like a dirty frosted screen. And through it something pressed close enough to clear the mist around itself. A round shape. Then edges. Then eyes. A boy, maybe 9 or 10, maybe younger. It was hard to judge because winter shrinks kids inside scarves, jackets, caps. His face was pale, not sickly pale like ghosts in movies, but weather-drained pale. The kind of pale you see in boys who play all day in cold without sun. His nose was a little red, like it had been running earlier. But his eyes were glassy, soaking the station lights instead of reflecting them. Too clear, too open. My eyes needed time to focus, but his looked like they needed nothing. Like he'd already been seeing me long before my gaze met his. He didn't blink. Not once. The window glass was maybe 2 to 3 inches thick from the metal frame, plus the grime layer. But he was close enough to make it feel like his forehead might brush it if the train shivered. The gap between us was smaller than it should ever be. Small enough that I could see the faint stretch marks of dry winter skin above his upper lip. Small enough to notice his eyelashes were clumped, as if fog or moisture had licked them into small spikes. Small enough that I could see faint dark smudges under his eyes. Not bruise-like, more like sleeplessness or heavy shadows from cold nights. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't frowning. He wasn't asking for money. He didn't look like any street kid or window beggar I had seen before or after in all those train journeys. Most beggar kids move, wave, ask, knock lightly on the window, point toward their mouths or shake a hand for coins. This one was doing none of that. His head wasn't tilted in curiosity either. It was held straight, neck tense like he'd locked it into place. His stare wasn't innocent, but it wasn't threatening either. It was hollowed by something human and real, like watching had become a habit instead of a choice. The fog coated everything below his chin. I couldn't see his coat, his chest, his hands, or his feet. Not clearly enough to form a body outline. The face looked like it was floating only because the fog swallowed the lower part of him, but I didn't think ghost. My brain tried to fill logic into it. Maybe he was very short, maybe crouched, maybe standing behind the concrete edge of the platform. Fog hides posture. It deletes limbs and leaves eyes first. I noticed small details that still haunt the realism of it. A tiny mole near his left earlobe. The uneven cut of his bangs under a cheap school cap I could barely see because the cap was also fog, gray like everything else. One lock of hair poked through the side, stiff with cold. His lips were a bit dry but tight, like air had stolen the moisture from them long ago. And his breath, when he exhaled, made a faint fog bloom on the glass, in a slow pulse, like he wasn't trying to make patterns, just breathing because the body must. I didn't move back. That's the part that puzzles me even now. Fear didn't hit at first. Shock does not always equal fear. I just stared because seeing felt bigger than thinking. My body stayed half wrapped in my brown shawl my mother had draped over me hours earlier. The shawl had thread pulls and tiny puffballs at the edges. My small hand clutched it near my chest without remembering I did it. The train made a distant tapping noise somewhere far ahead, metal shifting as passengers shuffled in other cabins unaware. I watched his gaze carefully, then tried to assess intention through habit. No knock, no ask, no motion, just presence. And presence is the weirdest human currency. We are trained to detect need from children faces, to read a pitch of voice, to detect desperation or request. But this one had no request. No words, no expression change. His face didn't shift even when the train groaned a little on its brakes. Most kids flinch when a metal cabin rattles at a sudden stop. He didn't. Like anticipation had ironed surprise out of him. The train jolted. A small jerk when brakes released to idle mode before departure. That mechanical cough the rail herd makes before moving again. I felt the compartment shake under me. My pillow bounced once. My mother stirred but didn't wake. My father's coat sleeve slipped lower from his chest as the cabin shifted. The door corridor lamp still buzzed outside, indifferent. The boy's face didn't pull back instantly. Motion made it slide back, slowly, a sliding that made no body movement visible. Like the train glided away and his face stayed stuck in place relative to the fog, drifting behind because distance pulled him, not his feet. He remained looking straight into me until the fog fully reclaimed him. No blink, no turning away, no head movement to track the speed. Just a face moving backward because the world was pulling it away inch by inch. Fog closed the frame around him like curtains around a performer who never took a bow. Then he was gone. Just the red station clock numbers fading behind like two coals sinking into cotton. Train wheels picked up tempo again. Slow first, then quicker. By 2:02 am we were in full motion again, Gujranwala sliding far behind. That's when fear finally hit. Fear has timing too. It arrives when logic runs out of fuel. I felt breath push against my ribcage uneven. My scalp prickled under my hair. The shawl felt rougher suddenly. The cabin felt too warm now compared to the ice memory clinging to the window glass seconds ago. My stomach flipped once like old sachet tea stirred too hard. I kept staring at the fog for a long time after, expecting repetition, pattern, explanation, a body outline at least. Nothing, just fog and poles and sleeping dogs and dim workers turning into gray watercolors behind us. For years I thought about that face, not as a ghost but as someone real, someone human. The kind of interaction that had no purpose but also too much purpose. Later in life, after joining friends on more train trips as a teen, I learned that stations past midnight are their own ecosystem. Some kids wander platforms because their parents are inside the waiting rooms. Some stand near trains just to watch the motion because it's the only show awake at that hour. But this face was too close. That closeness felt personal without being chosen. The next morning we reached Rawalpindi at 7:10 am, sunlight back, chai vendors alive, slippers slapping on platform stone. My parents woke and packed without noticing any of it. My school bag sat at the cabin corner where I had left it earlier. The zip pull of the bag was metal, chipped paint from daily use. I touched it and tried to feel normal again. Life moved clean and noisy after that. Fog melted, stations blurred. Faces behaved again, blinking and asking and reacting. But the boy from the window stayed in my head like a photograph taken without a camera. No moral, no ghost, just a small human moment that hit the wrong hour. The ending I give myself now is simple and clear because I know the world better. He was a real boy, just another child awake in winter fog on a platform in Gujranwala, standing too close to the only source of life moving past him at that hour. He never sought anything from me. He couldn't. Maybe because some children grow silent when life teaches them early that asking does not always work, that sometimes you only watch. I understand that now. The train didn't reveal his body not because it wasn't there, but because fog steals everything below the first thing you notice. And the first thing we notice in other humans is always their eyes. The moment was terrifying not for what it was, but for what a half-awake child brain tried to make of it. A face inches away in winter haze, silent beyond reason, disappearing without ceremony. My life didn't change after it, no tragedy followed, no missing reports, no police case. That alone confirms the truth more than any explanation could. Scary moments don't always lead to disasters. Sometimes they just quietly board the same train as your memory and refuse to leave. And that, for me, was horror enough. I was 8 in 2010, living in Hyderabad, Sindh. It was August, the kind of month where the nights still felt like ovens even after midnight. Our house was in Latifabad, one of those crowded middle-class areas where homes were packed close, walls shared heat like gossip, and rooftops were used for everything: drying clothes, storing junk, and holding those huge steel or plastic water tanks every house depended on. That summer was worse than usual. Load shedding was normal, but in peak heat it felt personal. The power went out at 12:18 a.m. that night, and by 12:21 a.m., the whole street was black. No tube lights, no street lamps, no TV noises, no water pump motors, nothing. The only thing keeping the air moving in my room was the big rusty, gray inverter fan mounted on the wall. The inverter itself sat in the corridor near my parents' room, an old homage model with dim green LEDs that lit the hallway like a weak signal from another world. The humming of the fan was steady, almost mechanical meditation. Not loud enough to distract, not quiet enough to forget. It was joined by a few other midnight sounds: a distant dog barking in bursts, motorbikes echoing every now and then, someone dragging metal in a faraway lane. Hyderabad's night symphony. Our own house had sounds too. The roof water tank always made settling noises at night. It would pop or groan or click when the temperature shifted. My father would call it plastic adjusting. My mother just called it old. To me it was a frog sitting in a box, croaking in shapes instead of voice. Still, it never scared me because it never sounded human. Until that night. At 12:26 a.m., the first knock sound hit my brain even though it was soft. I was half awake, lying on my charpai mattress with a wet towel under my neck that was meant to cool my pulse down. My shirt was sticky with sweat, my shorts glued to my skin, and the pillow felt damp like a sponge that had tried to remember a bathtub. The knock sound was slow, gentle, the kind of knock someone does when they don't want to wake a baby, but still want attention. And it came from above, from the water tank. I sat up just a little, elbows on the mattress, head tilted like my ears were small satellite dishes tuning themselves. The knock came again. One knock. Pause. Another knock. Small, centered, very deliberate. It didn't have the randomness of plastic expanding. It didn't have the hollow slap of wind hitting a loose sheet. It didn't sound like an animal scratching or something rolling around. It sounded like a fingertip or knuckle, tapping something firm but controlled. Worse, it sounded like it was coming from inside the tank, muffled by walls but clear in intent. The tank was one of those large black plastic Syntex-style tanks, 1,000 liters at least. It sat directly above the bathroom roof slab, raised a bit on 4 concrete blocks for support. It had a round lid at the top, heavy, slightly sun-faded, always shut properly. Hyderabad water situation was unpredictable, so we guarded that tank like treasure. The lid was wrapped in an old iron chain with a basic lock that had been on it for years. The lock always looked like it had lived through wars. Orange rust eating its corners, keyhole darkened with dust. The idea that someone could be inside it was insane, impossible. But my body didn't know logic then. Fear hijacks the bloodstream first, the brain later. I felt that physical signal trickle down my spine. I felt my heartbeat in the roof of my mouth. My palms cooled despite the heat, like they suddenly forgot what weather they were in. By 12:32 a.m., the knocking had happened maybe 6 or 7 times. Never fast, never chaotic, just spaced carefully like a code. I didn't look up again after a point. I just kept listening, trying to decide if I was imagining direction. Hyderabad rooftops were open access. Anyone could theoretically climb stairs in most homes, but getting into a locked water tank undetected? Highly unlikely. And yet a part of me started imagining scenarios. Maybe someone climbed up there. Maybe kids threw stones up there earlier. Maybe an animal jumped. Maybe pressure made weird rhythms now. But no explanation sat comfortably. Every logic I tried felt like a shirt that didn't fit. The night kept dragging. The battery backup fan blew lukewarm air because the inverter voltage always dipped under load. The blades spun slower than they should, making air that felt apologetic. Mosquitoes floated around because no electricity meant no mosquito zapper in the street outside. I remember hearing their wings far more clearly that night than ever before. The darkness sharpened small sounds too much. By 1:02 a.m., the sky outside my window shifted from pitch black to navy blue. A faint moon was trying hard to exist through humidity, but the cloud cover diluted it into milky haze. Hyderabad at night always had some dust in the air, but on no electricity nights it felt thicker. Like the world lowered its resolution. At 1:14 a.m., the knocking stopped. No fade out, no drama, just gone, like whoever or whatever was doing it decided the message had been sent, or heard, or abandoned. I lay back down but didn't sleep properly for the rest of the night. My body stayed in alert mode, like a car alarm that kept beeping quietly in your mind even after shutting down. By 4:58 a.m., the birds outside started. Sparrows first, then crows arguing near the electric wires outside. The sky turned orange-ish, dull but full. Somewhere nearby, a mosque speaker crackled slightly as the generator powered the Fajr at hand, then cut off again. Hyderabad mosques back then often used small generators because the power grid was unreliable. Morning light enters differently after a scary night. It doesn't feel comforting immediately. It feels like evidence. The kind of light you use to check a crime scene, not a sunrise. At around 6:17 a.m., my father climbed to the rooftop to inspect the tank. I vividly remember hearing the roof door creak open above us, then his footsteps across hot cement. Even in the early hours, the roof was already warm. The tank sat under direct sun most of the day, so it collected heat like a furnace. The metal latch of the roof gate would often burn to touch by 10 or 11 a.m. His inspection was practical, checking the lid seal, ensuring no cracks or leaks, making sure the chain and lock were intact, and it was. He told us later that the lid was exactly how it always was. Wrapped in the same chain, hanging tight, lock untouched. No sign of tampering, no scratches, no broken seal, nothing loose. But sitting on top of the lid was a stone, a single stone. Not a pebble, not a brick chip, not construction gravel. A solid, irregular, brown-gray stone the size of a child's fist. And it was centered perfectly on the lid. Balanced in the middle like someone placed it there, measured it there. No wind could do that. No random throw could guarantee that kind of center alignment. There was no boundary wall high enough near the tank for the stone to have naturally rolled there. No trees overhead, no birds capable of lifting a fist-sized rock and placing it like a trophy. No water pressure that could produce placement symmetry. No storm that night, no kids on the roof recently. No construction work happening on our slab for weeks. The stone was dry too. The tank lid often collected morning dew or condensation overnight, but the stone had no watermarks under it, meaning it hadn't sat there long enough for the moisture to form around its base. That suggested placement late at night or just before morning, not hours earlier. I later learned that fear makes you obsessive with detail retention. My brain stored everything like it was collecting files the width of the chain links, maybe 6-7 mm thick, old iron, rigid but intact. The smell near the roof, slight algae, mixed plastic scent from humid water storage. The way the lock hung, slanted slightly to one side, because the chain tension pulled it downwards unevenly. Even the dust pattern on top of the tank, fine silt that settled from the city's constant airborne grit, undisturbed except for the area directly beneath the stone. Under the rock, the black tank lid was a clean dark circle because the stone covered it, shielding it from dust that night. That little clean circle scared me almost as much as the sound itself because it proved interference, not imagination. For the next week, life had small behavioral changes. My father started checking the roof door before bed, tugging it twice to ensure the latch was firm. The tank stone was removed silently, no ceremony, no need for words. We kept using the water like nothing happened, because in cities like Hyderabad water is priority over mystery. You don't abandon supply because of one weird night. Years later, when I got older and understood animal behavior, physics, and human logic better, the incident finally found a realistic place in my head. The most likely explanation was this: someone, maybe a curious neighborhood kid or a local climber accessing rooftops, climbed up to throw stones around or test echo sounds inside tanks. Rooftop tanks in Hyderabad were sometimes knocked as pranks because children liked hearing the muffled drum-like sounds. Maybe whoever did it tried knocking the tank softly at night to avoid detection, lost interest before morning and placed the stone on top either as a marker, balance test, or just absent curiosity, without thinking someone below might overanalyze it later. There was also a second possibility my father mentioned later when retelling it once in passing. Sometimes herding trails and wilderness areas nearby brought shepherd kids off route into neighborhoods temporarily. They often played on rooftops during evenings, hopped between houses like alleys, and sometimes left small tokens unintentionally. Hyderabad is more porous than people admit. Not everyone uses official paths. Either way, the answer was human, not supernatural, which made it worse in a different way. Ghosts are stories. Humans are variables. You can survive fear of ghosts by growing up. But knowing another child, another human being, stood on your roof in the dead silent night, tapping from a locked tank you depended on, and leaving a stone like a signature. That stays with you longer, because the world doesn't always give reasons loud enough to hear. Sometimes it just knocks softly, proves access, and walks away before you can ask why. The fear stopped owning me by the time I was a teenager, but the memory stayed sharp because it was real and unresolved for too long. I don't shake when I think about it now. I don't feel the impulse to run or whisper survival lines into the dark. I just feel the old summer air, the inverter hum, Hyderabad's powerless nights, and the knowledge that the scariest moments aren't loud. They wait until everything else goes quiet enough for you to finally hear them. I was 12 in 2014, spending summer at my grandparents' village near Skardu. The place was small, dry, and quiet, tucked between hard mountains and long stretches of open land. Nights there felt different than the city. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it felt thicker, almost heavy. There were no street lights, no glowing shops, no passing cars. After Isha prayer, the village just shut down. The only sounds at night were the wind, the water channel, and sometimes the distant barking of dogs from the far side of the valley. Their house was old but strong, built with stone and wood. The roof was flat like most homes in the area, layered with mud and timber. The walls were thick enough to block cold in winter, but in summer they held the day's warmth and slowly let it go at night. The windows were small, framed in dark wood, and covered with thin curtains that would move every time someone walked past inside. The floors were rough, worn smooth in some places by decades of footsteps. There were wool rugs in the rooms, handmade by my nanny, faded reds and browns with patterns that didn't quite match up perfectly, which made them feel more real. My bedroom during visits was the storage room they had cleaned up for me. It had one charpai, a thin mattress, a pillow that smelled of sun-dried cotton, and a thick blanket folded at the edge even though it was summer, because nights in Skardu could get cold suddenly. Against one wall stood wooden crates of dried apricots, sacks of wheat grain, and metal canisters of kerosene oil. A small clay shelf sat above them holding prayer beads, a dusty radio, and some old medicine bottles. The room had a faint smell of fruit dust and oil mixed together. The door didn't close tightly unless pushed hard, so it always stayed slightly loose in the frame. The outhouse sat outside, 30 or 40 steps from the back door, a small stone structure with a tin roof. A narrow dirt path led to it, passing beside the water channel, then bending left near the apricot trees. The water channel was made of stone, flowing fast with cold glacier water even at night. During the day it looked fresh and harmless, but at night it sounded louder than it was, constant rushing water that masked smaller noises. The backyard was big but uneven, mostly dirt and stone. The apricot trees grew in a small cluster, 6 or 7 of them, spaced out enough for sunlight to fall between them. In summer, their leaves were thick, green, and slightly sticky near the stems. The fruit was nearly ripe in 2014 when I visited. Small, round apricots turning orange, some already soft enough to fall if a branch was nudged. Data would often walk there at night, sometimes during sleepless summer hours, holding a small yellow kerosene lantern, checking the irrigation, fixing branches, or simply making silent rounds the way old men in villages do. His lantern had a particular glow, yellow but uneven, brighter in the center, dimmer at the edges, flickering slightly when moved. I woke at 3:12 a.m. with a sudden need to use the bathroom. The inverter fan was humming in the main house, steady and electrical, the only artificial sound around. There was no moon that night, just faint pale stars smeared across a black sky. The air in the room felt cool against my arms when I sat up. My feet touched the wooden floor before the rug, slightly cold, dusty even though someone had swept the room earlier. The house was silent, no movement at all. I reached for the water bottle beside the charpai and drank a small sip, because my throat felt dry after sleep. Even water tasted colder there, sharper almost. I stood up slowly so the charpai wouldn't creak too loudly. It still made one small sound, a thin wooden sigh, but nothing unusual. I stepped onto the rug, which softened my foot sound, then grabbed the small torchlight Dada had given me when I arrived. It was a cheap plastic torch, gray with a small strap, slightly scratched from use. The battery inside was weak enough to dim if shaken, so I tried to keep it steady. Before turning it on, I walked to the window. Just out of instinct, like every kid who sleeps in a new dark place does, checking for shapes or shadows. I pushed the curtain aside with 2 fingers. The glass felt cool even through the wood frame. Outside was dark, but one thing stood out instantly, a yellow lantern glow moving slowly near the apricot trees. At first, I believed it was Dada. He sometimes woke too at odd hours, and this looked like his usual path. The light seemed to sway gently, the way a lantern does when someone walks slowly, but the movement was slower than normal, softer, almost deliberate. I didn't step out. Instead, I just watched. The backyard air looked perfectly still. No wind, no shaking branches, no rustling leaves. That detail hit first. Lanterns move when the air around them moves, but this one was gliding through stillness. The dirt path under it should have crunched a little, but there was no sound. Nothing at all. I called out softly without opening the door, still thinking it would be him. My voice felt strangely loud in the silence, but there was no reply. The lantern kept moving for another second, then it stopped. It paused right between 2 trees, half hidden by leaves, hanging motionless like a photo frozen in place. Then it lifted slightly. Smooth, slow rise, like someone had raised it to shoulder level. That was not a normal motion. A lantern doesn't float up by itself. Hands lifted, but no shape appeared. No arm shadow, no body outline. Just light rising into height it shouldn't reach alone. Then the light turned off instantly. No fading glow, no dimming, no last tremble. Just gone, like someone had placed a hand over it and killed the flame in one snap. The suddenness felt unnatural, sharp, almost mechanical. After it vanished, the trees went silent too. Not a single leaf sound after. Not one dog barking, not one cricket sound. The water channel still rushed, unaware of anything. I turned the torch on carefully and walked to the door. The light came on weak, white, thin beam. I opened the back door just enough to step out, heart shifting speed inside my chest. The hinges were old iron, dry, slightly rusted. They made a tiny scrape when the door moved, a thin metal whisper. The cold air of the open land touched my face instantly, dry but sharp. Stepping out felt like crossing into another world. The sky was bigger, wider, closer almost, like the mountains pulled it down. The smell outside was soil, cold stone, tree leaves, and distant snow mixed into one clean but thin oxygen smell. The path to the outhouse passed beside the water channel, so I walked along it carefully. The ground wasn't flat, small stones shifted under my feet, not loudly, but quietly, clicking 1 or 2 taps per step. The apricot tree stood 10 or 12 feet away to my right, dark, thick, unmoving. As I walked, I kept my torch aimed forward, scared of what I'd see if I pointed it sideways. But after 5 or 6 steps, curiosity forced me to glance. I turned the beam toward the trees. Light hit branches and leaves, but no person, no lantern, no sign of anyone who was just there seconds ago. The space between the trees, where the light had paused, was empty. The grass patch was slightly flattened, like someone had stood there, but that could have been anything in a village where animals also roam. A goat, a child, even a passing shadow earlier in the day. Nothing solid enough to confirm. I continued to the outhouse. The tin roof above it glimmered faintly when torchlight touched it. The door was made of thin metal sheet, slightly dented, cold to touch when I pulled it open. Inside was the usual smell. Dry pit earth mixed with humidity from the channel water, strong enough to make a city kid wince but normal for villages. When I finished and stepped back out, I noticed a detail I had walked past earlier. The ground near one tree had a tiny ash circle, faint, thin like leftover residue from a flame being killed. But the circle was too neat. Wind-blown flame ash splashes uneven. This one looked pressed into soil. Small, deliberate, clean-edged, like made intentionally or covered quickly afterward. I knelt slightly and touched the soil. Cool, dry, grainy. The ash smudged only lightly when rubbed, meaning it was fresh. Hours-old ash mixes into dust or blows away in open yards. This still sat intact. I didn't run to wake anyone. Because in villages, people laugh at night fears of kids, and a lantern turning off fast could have many explanations. Someone shielding the flame manually, closing a vent on it, or even having moved it behind a wall. But there were no walls there, just open trees. That part felt wrong. Back inside, I sat on the charpai holding the torch, replaying the seconds in my head over and over. The fan hummed above in the main room like a reminder that machines behave normally, flames don't. Morning came late there. At 6 or 7 the sky was still pale blue, mountains slowly turning gold as sun traveled down their faces. Birds began chirping near the channel. Everything felt normal again, like night was a liar that couldn't hold its story after sunrise. Later that day I checked the backyard again with daylight confidence. The ash circle was gone, fully mixed into dust, invisible to the eye unless someone knew exactly where to look. Days passed like this event never happened. And that was the horror of it. Nothing dramatic confirmed it. Nothing loud explained it. No magical creature appeared. Just one still night moment that didn't fit into logic. Years later, when I grew older, the memory still stayed sharp. The mountains didn't scare me. The silence did. Silence that felt practiced, trained, intentional. Silence that only appears when something doesn't want to be noticed. When I finally asked a local farmer about unusual yard visitors at night, just casually, after some years he explained that in old villages, some men made silent rounds for orchard stealing. Groups would sometimes move lanterns to check fruit ripeness without being heard. To avoid dogs barking, they would walk when water channels were loudest, masking footsteps. And if spotted, lanterns would be killed instantly using metal vents or lids to stop any giveaway glow. That explanation finally closed the story for me. Human hands, human silence, human intentions. No ghosts, just people moving at hours they shouldn't. The horror didn't come from legends, but from the fact that something real, something human, stood there in complete silence watching a child call for a reply, holding a flame it removed too cleanly. I never slept in that storage room alone again after that summer. Skardu visits continued, but with new habits. A brighter torch, a locked wooden door, and no late-night bathroom walks unless the sun was somewhere in the sky. The memory settled into something real, explainable, closed, but heavy enough to remind me that fear doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply stands, pauses, raises a light, then turns it off in a heartbeat before anyone can prove it was there. It was 2006. I was 6 years old, living in Clifton, Karachi. We lived in one of those older houses with tall boundary walls, paint that was meant to be white but had turned gray from years of dust, sea salt, and rain. Our street was lined with neem trees that shook hard whenever it rained, dropping wet leaves onto parked cars and making that soft pat sound on the roofs. The drains always overflowed during rain, even when the rain wasn't that heavy, sending brown water crawling along the street edge carrying plastic wrappers, soggy cartons, and dead leaves. That afternoon, the rain came suddenly. It wasn't a storm, but it was the warm monsoon kind that hits Karachi sideways, heavy enough to blur your eyes, loud enough to silence everything else, but gentle enough to still feel normal. By 40:30 p.m., the sky was fully covered. The air smelled like wet cement, mud, and the ocean, all mixed into one sharp scent that always told you it would rain for at least an hour. The wind slapped cold onto my bare arms. I remember my school uniform shorts sticking to my skin, pockets slightly wet because I'd been outside when it started, trying to get one clean delivery bowl from the cricket pitch line before my slippers filled with water. We had a small open plot at the end of our lane where the kids played cricket almost every day. It was just dry, cracked soil, no grass, sometimes sharp little stones poking out. The wickets were bricks standing at both ends. Nothing fancy. We used a tape ball or tennis ball most days, and when we got lucky, someone would bring a proper cricket ball. That day we actually had a real cricket ball, which felt serious. I'd been fielding near the edge, close to the boundary wall of the house next door to the plot. Someone swung too hard, and the ball flew over the boundary, bounced once on the wet road, then rolled straight into the front yard of the neighbors, who lived behind a heavy metal gate. The neighbors were a quiet family. At least that's how it felt then. The house had the same tall wall as most Clifton homes, but their gate always stayed closed. Dark green metal bars, a small rust patch near the bottom from water pooling, and a lock that looked older than me. They hardly came out to chat or wave. I'd only seen the man maybe twice, always serious, always in plain clothes, walking fast to a silver Suzuki head down. No hanging around, no smiling, no talking to anyone. No kids ever came out of that house to play. The windows were tinted brown from age or film, so you could never clearly see inside even in bright sun. The curtains usually stayed drawn. When the ball rolled into their yard, the older boys told me to go return it and say sorry for the hit. Looking back, I think they just didn't want to cross an adult boundary themselves, so they pushed the only small kid into that job. I didn't really think about danger. I only thought about the ball. It was ours, and cricket rules are serious even to kids. If you lose the ball, you feel like you failed at life. I walked over, holding a soaked plastic bag because one boy told me it might make it look more polite than just carrying a wet ball back in my hand. I slipped on my still, wet orange flip-flops, stepped out of the pitch area, and started toward their gate. The rain was steady but not loud right then, like someone had turned the volume knob down a little. The street was shiny from water. Puddles sat everywhere, reflecting the dark sky like black mirrors. I hopped around them at first, then gave up and started splashing straight through. I remember the cold water touching my ankles, creeping between my toes. My heart wasn't racing then. It was calm, just the calm of a kid on a mission. Their bell was a small white button fixed beside the gate. The plastic around it had yellowed. I pressed it once. It made that short, dull electric buzzer sound, not the nice sharp ding sound that some newer house bells made. No answer. I pressed it again after half a minute. Still nothing. The rain dripped from the edge of the roof shade above their gate, landing on my hair in heavy drops. I wiped my forehead, stood on my toes a little, and stared at the gate bars. It was shut tight. I waited, bag in hand, ball inside, proud of myself for being responsible. Then I noticed the letterbox. It was a thin metal flap cut into a small door fixed to the side of the gate. Most letterboxes in the neighborhood were tight, but this one hung slightly loose at the edges, like it had been used for years and someone had pulled it open without much care. The flap was closed, but you could slip your fingers under it and lift it. At 6 years old, opening a letterbox felt harmless. It felt like checking a rain gutter or peeking behind the fridge. Just normal kid curiosity. I bent forward and lifted the flap. The inside of their hallway was dark in a way that didn't fit afternoon rain darkness. It looked like night. Thin shadows everywhere, thick blackness in the corners. No lights. No color. Just shapes. The further end of the hall was invisible, like someone had painted over it in matte black. The walls were cream, but the darkness made them look gray. There were wooden cabinets on the left side, maybe for shoes or storage, but all I saw were sharp lines of shadow. The floor tiles were white, but they looked soaked in darkness. No movement at first. No sound. No noise except the rain falling outside on my own back and neck. Then the eye appeared, right there inside the slot. No blink, no shine, no jump scare movement. No surprise reaction. No widening like a normal person who suddenly catches a face outside their gate. Just stillness. Like the eye had been there before I even opened the flap, already locked in place, already staring through the tiny gap, waiting for someone to look. I remember the feeling clearly. The world shrank. The rain stayed outside the frame. The only thing that existed for a moment was that small, narrow rectangle of metal darkness, and the unmoving eye pressed close enough that I saw the tiny blood threads in the corner, the slight purple tint under the lower lid, and the heavy, slow calm of someone who wasn't startled by being watched. It wasn't the behavior of a fairy story monster. It was the stillness of a real person who should not be that calm. A second later, the eye was gone. Before my brain even finished processing that it had been there, sound hit. Footsteps. Fast, loud, inside the hallway. Not the slow, regular steps of someone walking toward the door after hearing a bell. These were sprinting footsteps. Bare or soft-soled, slick on tile. The kind of sound you hear when someone runs full speed indoors, body leaning forward, no hesitation, no slowdown, momentum built for chase, not conversation. I jumped back so fast the flap fell shut. My plastic bag hit the wet ground, splashing once. My slippers slipped under me as I turned and ran. A car horn blared somewhere on the main road, but it felt far away then, like it belonged to another life. My scream came out before I even knew I was screaming. I didn't look back at the letterbox again. I didn't look at the door. I didn't stay to confirm anything. My legs burned from the sudden run. Rainwater sprayed behind me with every step. I ran past the cricket pitch, past the kuyas of brown water inching by the drains, past the boys yelling, and straight into our front yard, crashing through our own gate, hands cold and shaking. I didn't stop running until I was inside the house, barefoot on the living room carpet, heart punching like it was trying to break my ribs. That night, my parents checked the neighbor's gate again, but nothing had changed. The gate was still closed, no sign of opening, no lights, no sounds, no reaction. It sat silent under a sky that finally cleared by 10 p.m., clouds moving out toward the sea. Over the next weeks, I watched the house differently. I would sit near our gate each afternoon, pretending to play with toy cars in water puddles, but really just staring at their windows and door. Nothing ever looked out from the slot again. Nothing ever opened. No voices came out. No furniture moved. No visitors. No cars leaving or returning for long stretches of time. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath. The next month they moved out. No notice, no goodbye wave. No boxes dragged to a truck during daytime like regular families did. One morning, a small pickup van sat outside their gate. Men loaded belongings fast without noise, no chatting, no laughing, no small talk, no arguments. The curtains came down, the cabinets left. The silver Suzuki never returned. The gate stood open for the first time that day, revealing the same dark hallway I had seen through the slot. It looked normal in daylight but older, dustier, emptier. No extra drama. No blood. No signs of a fairy tale. Just a house that had felt too quiet for too long. After they left, the real horror settled in my head slowly, like wet clothes drying over hours. The memory didn't explode like a story ghost. It kept returning quietly instead, especially during rain noises or when the electricity went out. For years, I never pressed a stranger's bell alone again. I never assumed a closed door meant safety. I never bent to peek into spaces that were only meant for letters. The relief in the ending was real though. Because nothing supernatural saved us, reason did. Adults checking, time passing, the family leaving, a normal neighborhood returning to its ordinary noise, ordinary chaos, ordinary rain smell. And that's how I know it was real horror. Not because of magic, but because a human eye can sometimes look through a tiny slot and show you a stillness you were never meant to see. I was 9 in 2011 in Faisalabad. I studied in a government school near People's Colony. The building was old, square-shaped, 2 floors, paint faded yellow. The classrooms had metal rail windows and thick brick walls that stayed warm in winter and unbearably hot in summer. Our room was on the ground floor. The back wall of our classroom was not facing the street like the others. It faced a huge abandoned textile storage lot. The lot had once belonged to a factory that shut down years earlier. My father told me once that they used to keep cotton bales, dyes and packed cloth there before trucks carried it away. By 2011, it was empty, completely unused. Tall rusty gates locked with chains thicker than my wrist. No guard, no workers, nothing. Just a massive rectangle of land full of cracked concrete, weeds, broken wooden pallets, and some faded shipping containers parked forever like metal bricks. At the far end of the lot was a low tin roof warehouse. The tin sheets were bent inward from age. When it rained, water didn't hit the metal roof sharply anymore. It tapped dull and deep, like someone knocking from underneath it. We could never see much through the windows at the back. Dust had permanently settled on the glass, but small holes in some panes allowed thin lines of air to pass through. The lot smelled like old fabric that had absorbed rainwater, sun heat, and engine smoke for years. That sweet but rotten scent of cotton and industrial dust mixed together. In summer, that smell became stronger, thicker, like warm sugar that had expired. The wall behind our classroom was directly connected to the outer boundary of that lot. Thick bricks, rough cement, and dark stains near the lower side where rain splashed for a decade. Sometimes lizards crawled there, tapping tiny claws against the surface. But lizards don't whisper. Our benches were wooden with black iron frames. Mine was the second row from the back wall, slightly chipped on the right corner where someone else had carved initials years ago. It was afternoon around 1:11 p.m. The sun outside was bright but hazy. Faisalabad always had a layer of floating dust in the air in those years. Not smog like Lahore, but that industrial city dust that never fully disappears even after rain. The ceiling fan above me was spinning on inverter power because the electricity had gone out an hour earlier. The fan didn't rotate smoothly. The blades wobbled slightly, making a slow humming vibration that turned every quiet moment a little uncomfortable. Our classroom felt like a furnace. Polyester school uniform sticking to my skin, sweat forming under my collar. Blackboard dust mixed with humidity, settling into our hair and faces. I could feel tiny grains between my fingers when I rubbed my neck. The lecture was dull. The teacher reads straight from the book. I remember the heavy silence that boredom creates. Not normal silence, but that thick quiet where everyone stares forward yet listens to nothing. My notebook was open but blank. My pencil tip blunt, my thoughts drifting between lunch break memories of samosas and the chance of cricket after school. Hamza sat next to me on the left. We weren't gossiping. We were melting in our seats, minds half asleep, bodies overheated. Then came the whispers. At first it was just one or two voices. Very soft, the kind of sound you assume you imagined. But it was sharp enough to break through the fan's wobbling hum. The voices were coming from behind me, not behind the bench. Not from the window, from inside the wall. Directly from the brick layer touching my back. It sounded like multiple kids speaking at the same time, whispering fast. Their tones were high-pitched, overlapping, breathless. The words were clear as syllables, but the language was something I had never heard before. Not Urdu, Punjabi, English, or Sindhi. Not Arabic like Nats. It was messy, quick, jittering speech, almost rhythmic like a recording glitching and looping on itself but spoken by real voices. It was not wind. Wind hisses. Wind does not make consonants. It grew louder quickly. Within seconds it went from faint to crowded. Dozens of whispers layered together like a pile of school children hiding under a desk talking at once. The wall felt firm, motionless, yet the sound was alive. I felt a cold wave hit my scalp, the opposite of the heat around me. Sweat still rolled down my spine, but my brain felt iced, my stomach squeezed. My ears locked on the noise because it was too human to ignore but too alien to understand. I saw Hamza stiffen as well. He subtly leaned back a half-inch without turning at first, like he was testing if the noise changed with movement. It did not. The sound stayed centered within the wall itself, not affected by distance like sound normally is. Our heads turned at the same time instinctively, slowly, eyes meeting the back wall. I remember the skin on my arms prickling like someone had pointed a hairdryer set to cold directly at me. I wanted to press my palm to the wall, to see if it vibrated, but fear made me freeze. I didn't visualize ghosts. I visualized danger the same way you do when you hear voices where none should be. Our school had no basement. The boundary wall had no crawl space. That textile lot behind it had been excavated and concrete paved. No human cavity existed in that structure. The voices peaked in volume suddenly. Still whispers, but loud whispers, aggressive in number. It felt like the wall had become a speaker. I could almost sense individual breaths, rushed but quiet, like kids who knew they weren't supposed to be heard. But they didn't react to us hearing them. They didn't gasp or stop. They just kept pouring words. Then the teacher slammed the chalk on the table. The chalk hit didn't echo longer than usual. But the intent behind it was sharp, loud, irritated. The teacher assumed we were talking during his lecture. His eyes didn't look behind us, just at us. That chalk strike was his warning. The moment chalk met wood, the whispers snapped off clean, too clean, like someone had yanked a plug. No fading, no trailing off, no final syllables. 1 millisecond there was a storm of rushing whispers. The next there was nothing but the fan wobble again and the dusty heat. My ears rang from the sudden contrast. Silence has weight when a heavy noise leaves instantly. Teachers' chalk strikes had happened many times before when kids misbehaved, but only once did they erase sound inside a wall. My pulse was hammering. My lungs felt tight, like someone pressed on them gently but firmly. My face must have shown it because the teacher assumed guilt. He scolded us sharply. His voice sounded distant to me, even though he stood in front of the class because my brain was still stuck at the back wall, replaying the whisper storm I heard seconds earlier. Hamza didn't argue. He didn't justify. We both sat rigid, eyes forward, hands sweating around pencils, absorbing blame we didn't earn. But fear makes you mute even when innocence should make you speak. After school, I refused to look back at the wall when we exited. The boundary wall of the lot looked dead from the outside. Big bricks, gray cement, no vents, no cracks wide enough for voices to leak, no hidden door. Nothing but old damp stains and creeping moss near the bottom where sewer moisture kissed the foundation for years. For weeks after that, I paid attention to every sound that came from that direction. There were normal lot noises sometimes, a plastic bag scratching on broken concrete, a cat knocking a tin can, pigeons landing on containers, the wind buzzing through broken fencing. But there were no more whispers. Whatever leaked that day leaked only once, triggered by a quiet moment and switched off by a chalk slam like an accidental off button. Years later in my teens, that textile lot got demolished and sold. A housing project was built there. During excavation, workers found an old underground water channel under the warehouse. Narrow, knee-deep, half-collapsed. The channel had once allowed drainage for dyed water from the factory. It connected nowhere safe anymore, clogged by decades of debris. Engineers later said that channels like those, when half-collapsed, could trap air and create human-like vocal distortions when pressure shifts. Rare, but not impossible. The day it happened behind me, the pressure shift must have mimicked a crowd of voices almost perfectly. Hamza and I were just unlucky enough to sit against the one wall where an abandoned industrial cavity could distort dead air into the most human, chaotic whisper chorus a kid could ever hear. Now when I pass that area, the houses are clean, new, ordinary. No factory, no gates, no pallets, no containers. Just children in uniforms walking home unaware of what used to sit under their feet. The ending is clear in my mind. No ghosts were there. It was an industrial scar buried poorly under concrete and memory. Real, proven, mechanical. And somehow, that makes it worse, because reality made a wall whisper 100 voices at two terrified 9-year-old boys, stopped by chalk, and never repeated again.